I want to start by this question. So what is activity-based working? When we ask this question, people often confuse it with terms like flexi space, co-working, hoteling, or maybe open floor plan. It is a concept that is usually referred to as a workspace strategy, maybe with some innovative technology that supports people working there. So people naturally start to think about the floor plan as the key to activity-based working. Now, I want you to take a step back and look at this chart on the left. What is missing from this floor plan? What is the critical component that everything is designed to support? I'd like to have you type your response in that chat box. It can be just a single word or some short comments, nothing complicated here. Oh, yes. Well, life, culture, people. Yeah, it is the people who work in the workspace and the underlying culture which defines where and how people do their jobs. Activity-based working is more than just a physical space. It is a way of working where people can choose where they work, when they work, how they work, and with whom they work, based on the activities they need to perform. Physical space and technology are important components, but they're merely the options provided to people. It is a culture that determines people's ability to use the physical space. In our past ABW client engagements, we've seen various levels of success when companies transition into activity-based working. We know anecdotally how some of the shifts happen. For example, we usually see people reporting higher sense of productivity and more collaboration. And companies who focus more on the intangible aspects of the ABW tend to achieve more positive outcomes. For this research project, we want to know exactly what are some of the patterns in people's reaction to activity-based working? Where does ABW work and where doesn't it work? And what contribute to successful activity-based working transition? To set the foundation for us to answer those questions, first we need to know what measurable impact does activity-based working have?
And so with that, we started just like any researchers would at the beginning of a research, we started looking into the literature. We tried to understand what has already been studied about activity-based working. I'm just going to show you a glimpse into how we experienced the search process. One study from 2004 found that for a Dutch municipality, a move from cellular office to flexible space correlated with a drop in productivity. But the same researcher studied a Dutch financial institute and found the opposite, where a move into a more flexible space actually enhanced people's positive perceptions. Another study in 2017 of a Swedish insurance company tried to uncover the impact of activity-based workplaces through a longitudinal study. Now, out of the 100 employees who participated in the relocation, they were able to collect 34 qualifying responses that had the pre-post matches and came to the conclusion that the relocation had no effect on productivity, but there was an increase in satisfaction. Now, fast forward to the summer of 2018, when a study from two professors at the Harvard Business School really raised a ruckus in the US. They were collecting data using sociometric badges and tracking employees' digital communications, and they found that boundaryless open floor plan offices were related to a decrease in face-to-face communications, which was then replaced by an increase in digital interactions. Many reporters at that time cited this research as putting the nail on the coffin for open floor plan offices. A boundaryless open plan office does not really represent activity-based work environment, so we looked closer. One such study suggests that within their sample, the most reliable predictor for satisfaction in activity-based work environment was a preference for such environment prior to the move. And to them, activity-based or flexible office did not really do well in supporting focus demanding tasks, but they did not really uncover any impact on communicative tasks. So in short, if any of you has tried to investigate the impact of activity-based working through a review of empirical research, I'm sure your experience is similar to ours. Previous research shares a lot of useful guidelines, but often they are limited by mixed outcomes, smaller or small-ish sample size. A lot of the research that I discovered were Northern European centric, mostly because activity-based working as a concept had been more mature and more widely implemented in Northern European countries, and then not enough pre-post comparisons. So we came back to the drawing board and thought about our research question again. What do we have that the typical researchers may not have? And a few advantages that we considered. As a consultancy firm, we tend to have longer engagement with our client projects, which offers more opportunities for pre-post comparisons. We also get in contact with projects of varying sizes and located in different countries, different continents, and different areas. And lastly, we tend to have very extensive knowledge of the process. When you're just looking at the research published by other researchers, a lot of times you see a picture of the pre, a picture of the post, but you don't really know what happened in the middle. In this situation, we do know a lot of times what's happening in the middle, which lends us additional insight into what may help to explain the data. So with that, we modified our question just a little bit to what measurable impact does activity-based working transitions have, with the focus really on the transitions and the change that such project can bring to organizations. We partnered with Leesman in the past 7 years or so to collect data from our clients about their workplaces. Over the course of this partnership, we've gathered nearly 100,000 individual responses. But because for this research, we were more interested in the impact of an activity-based working transition, we narrowed our database by about 2/3 and focused on 29 projects only. Now, very quickly about the selection criteria, how we got to these 29 projects, which is the equivalent of 58 surveys. They were very carefully selected based on two important criteria. First, they must have matched pre and post move surveys of roughly the same demographics. And second, the architectural design must reflect the basic activity-based principle, which means that the physical space at least has some differentiation in settings for different activities. So an example, like a straight up open floor plan would have been excluded from our study. So after we've done that narrowing, we still were able to obtain about 32,000 responses, 19,000 of which were from pre-move surveys and roughly 13,000 for post-move. And within the sample, we were still able to cover 11 countries, 23 regions, and across 16 organizations. So we started with our initial analysis. We plotted these 58 surveys, these 29 projects on a chronological timeline. And on the y-axis, we're showing the overall impact score. The overall workplace impact score is a composite of employees' agreement levels with several statements about the workplace normalized onto a 0 to 100 scale so that we can do more intuitive comparisons between a few other dimensions and concepts we'll be talking about soon. A few patterns emerged when we did this first initial comparison. So on average, post-move scores, which are represented by the teal color on the screen here, are higher than pre-move scores, which are represented by the orange colors. And when we look at the aggregate, on average, there's about a 17% increase on overall impact score post-transition. We do have a little bit more post-move data in the later years and more pre-move data on the earlier years, which is intuitive, makes sense. Size does not always correlate to scores, but we do notice a few high posts are relatively smaller in size, especially if you look sort of straight up at 2019-ish. And for that, that just simply suggests that smaller projects may have higher possibilities of achieving better results. And lastly, a note about the range. And as you can see, the range for both pre-move scores or the spread and that of the post-move scores are quite large. We then started to look at the subdimensions of the overall impact score and noticed similar patterns. So starting with perceptions on productivity. The survey asked individuals to rate on the Likert scale on their agreement level with a statement, the workplace enables me to work productively, and that's how we got the individual productivity score. And another statement that goes, the workplace enables us to work productively, and that's how we got to the team productivity score. So similarly, when just looking at the average, there is an improvement. At first, we were very happy with this because this shows that we're doing the right thing. We are doing a good job. And as organizations transition into activity-based working, on average, employees felt that they've been able to be more productive, and quite impressively so when it comes to the individual productivity. We notice similar patterns for organizational culture, which the question is the workplace has a positive impact on organizational culture and employees' sense of community. But a slight uneasiness unfolds, similar to the pattern that we saw for the overall impact scores. The range of scores bucked us. It was all nice and glorious to look at the high scores in the post-transition part, but the low scores left us wondering what is happening here. We're not surprised about the range in the pre-move because we hypothesized that people would have entered into activity-based work environments from various pre-move situations. It could be an open floor plan, it could be private offices, it could be a super old office that hasn't been renovated in decades. But the post-move range was really a surprise for us. So we added another question to our next phase of exploration. How do activity-based working transitions differ? And what could be behind the difference? What can we learn from the high-performing ones? What stood in the way of the ones not doing so well?
Right, and this question brings us to the table of projects here with their change in overall impact scores. As you can see here in the highlighted column, the change in overall impact score has a huge range from -10 to 33. There are organizations that achieved great success, while some others had negative experience with activity-based working transition. To show how activity-based working transitions differ for these organizations, we grouped the top 25% together and called them the LEAP projects, with LEAP indicating high improvement in overall impact. And the bottom 25% is labeled as STEP projects, indicating minor or even negative improvement. This grouping method allows us to compare the two groups and isolate factors that could have contributed to the high improvement of the LEAP projects. Based on our experience with activity-based working, choice and flexibility are the critical factors contributing to a successful activity-based working transition. Choice is about the match between employees' work style and the support they receive in the office. We're interested in which work activities are considered important for people and how well are these activities supported. Flexibility, on the other hand, assesses how flexible or mobile employees are when they work in the activity-based office space. Do they switch work settings based on activities? Do they have adequate support to work in a mobile way? And what are some other factors that contribute to internal mobility? Our research project provided answers to most of these questions. As you can see here, these are the 7 findings we've discovered. Now I'm going to walk you through them. When we look at the perceived importance of activities, we observe that the ratings are similar across LEAP and STEP projects and before and after the activity-based working transition. The top three are always individual desk-based focus work, plant meetings, and telephone communication. This shows us that activity-based working doesn't fundamentally change how people prioritize their activities. But one trend we see here is that post-change importance ratings are relatively lower across the 21 activities. One possible explanation is that people just had a better understanding of the activities in the transition period, so they're able to provide more accurate ratings afterward. We then compared people's satisfaction of support received for the activities between LEAPS and STEPS projects. And here we can see a difference. For the LEAPS project on top, we observe improved satisfaction in most activities, especially for the ones related to social interaction and well-being. STEPS results are more mixed, so satisfaction after the move is very similar to the pre-move baseline. For the three activities that did not show positive impact are learning from others, spreading out paper, and using technical equipment, as you can see they're highlighted on the screen. The lower satisfaction for spreading out paper is expected, as activity-based working is usually parallel to organizations' digitalization initiative. And using technical equipment, on the other hand, it's more job specific and also related to the technical aspect of the equipment. We also found interesting results when comparing LEAPS and STEPS project results on the impact of workspace on culture and sense of community. For the impact on culture, both LEAPS and STEPS reported positive impact of workspace on culture before the transition. And we can see here STEPS scores are higher compared to LEAPS. Through the transition, LEAPS project achieved a 37% improvement from 54 to 76. But for STEPS, there is actually a drop here, so from 66 to 60. A similar pattern also shows up when we look at the impact on sense of community. This again, it illustrates the big variation in how activity-based working shows up for different organizations and the importance of investing in culture which bring people together and create a positive feeling around working together as a team. Now, after culture and sense of community, let's just switch gear and focus on flexibility. Internal mobility is a typical representation of flexibility in the workspace. We adopted these 4 levels of mobility when conducting our analysis. Level 1 is the least mobile, with people performing most of their activities at a single work setting. As we move down the ladder, we'll see more and more switching from one work setting to another. And at level 4, people they just use multiple work settings regularly and basically never base themselves at a single location in the office. By looking at the aggregate data, so we're talking about all the projects here, we see that before activity-based transition, about 80% of people are in less mobile group 1 and 2. And after the transition, there is a shift in mobility distribution. We can see more people start to switch work settings as there are more people in mobility level 3 and 4. So the 2 groups on the bottom. For mobility level 4, the percentage of people even tripled after the transition. Now, we've seen how the distribution of internal mobility shifts after activity-based working transition. We'll take a deeper look at how people benefit from being mobile with activity-based working. Before moving into activity-based working, looking at the yellow lines here, we don't see a clear pattern of the relationship between mobility and overall impact of the workplace. After the transition, a positive correlation started to appear. The correlation is especially stronger in the lead projects on the left. Apart from the fact that all 4 groups reported higher overall impact scores, the more mobile people get, the more likely they will report positive experience in activity-based working. When we look at the STEPS project on the right side, all mobility levels reported lower overall impact scores. Mobility level 1 showed the biggest drop, suggesting that people who are not used to switching work settings struggled but the most in activity-based working. When we change the y-axis and look at the relationship between mobility and productivity, the same pattern shows up again. And here it is worth pointing out that even in lead projects, people who are not able to switch work setting and take advantage of the work space suffered from productivity loss in activity-based working. It is clear at this point that internal mobility is a predictor of success for activity-based working. But we're curious, what are the factors that contribute to internal mobility? Activity complexity is one of the factors that are usually associated with people's ability or motivation to switch work settings. In our analysis, activity complexity is the number of activities people consider as important out of the 21 activities being considered in the Leesman survey. When we plot overall impact score against activity complexity for all projects, we can see that after the transition to activity-based working, looking at the blue line here, there is a positive correlation between activity complexity and overall impact. People with higher job complexity tend to have more positive experience compared to people with less job complexity. But does it mean that activity-based working is just not for people with lower job complexity or less need to move around? Not necessarily. We can find some clues here when looking at mobility and complexity together. On this chart, the 4 vertical panels are the 4 mobility levels, and for each panel, the x-axis is activity complexity. Overall impact score is the y-axis, and again, we've broken down the chart into leaps and steps, with leaps on top and steps on the bottom. When we look at the 2 less mobile groups on the left, there isn't a clear relationship between activity complexity and overall impact. This suggests that when people are still desk-bound and don't take advantage of work settings being provided, people who juggle multiple roles would be just as happy as those people whose roles focus on less activities. When we look at mobility level 3 and 4 on the right, a similar pattern to the previous chart starts to appear. People with higher activity complexity tend to benefit more from activity-based working. But I want to point out a nuanced observation here. So when we look at the top right corner, even people with low activity complexity could achieve high mobility in activity-based working and enjoy the benefits it brings. They can just simply benefit from switching from one desk to another, supporting the same activity. A change of scenery or even the different people they encounter could help them feel refreshed and maybe come up with new ideas. At last, we come to age. It is commonly believed that older people does not adapt well to activity-based working, possibly because they're just more attached to the desk-bound way of working. And our finding is partially in line with this belief. We observe a negative correlation between age and overall impact, with the 55 to 64 age group showing minimal improvement, and the 65 or above group showing a big drop in overall impact after the activity-based working transition. But older people, they're not doomed to feel miserable in activity-based working. By breaking down our projects into leaps and steps, we can see that in the leaps projects, older employees reported improvement in overall impact. Although the benefit is less significant compared to the other age groups, this shows that activity-based working is not always a burden for those older employees. With proper change management process in place, they can also enjoy the new work styles just like their younger colleagues. To summarize what we've talked about, so we've seen perceived importance of activities consistent across groups before and after the activity-based working transition. But the level of support for these activities are much higher in LEAPS projects compared to STEPS projects. There's also a different, when we look at the impact of workplace on culture and sense of community. LEAPS projects showed improvement, but STEPS didn't. When we look at flexibility in the office, both LEAP and STEP projects became more mobile after the transition. Internal mobility is positively correlated with overall impact and perceived productivity after the transition, especially for the LEAP projects. Role complexity as the extra layer we added here in our analysis does not predict satisfaction alone. Both the complex and the less complex roles can benefit from activity-based environment when using the space in a more flexible way. And the last piece, age predicted dissatisfaction only for stepped projects and not for lead projects.
Our analysis suggests that high-performing leap transitions are doing a better job at providing the right support for work activities and creating organizational culture where it is the norm to let individuals choose the optimal settings for themselves. Um, so we looked at what the leap projects had in common and came up with four main buckets of findings. First, to address the challenge of employees not using the space as intended, um, these transitions tend to really focus on shaping the layout with users through co-creation. Involve users at the concept development stage and invite them to learn from the design process, as this will give them the assurance that their voices are heard, and it provides an opportunity for them to appreciate and discover for themselves the best ways to use the new space. Changing the ways of working also requires addressing people's personal attachment to what it was before. And so in addition to traditional change management or transition management, successful projects also tend to invest in the thorough process to help users through detaching and reattaching. We often tell our clients to start driving changes in ways of working way in advance of space transitions. It's very important to guide employees to co-create agreements in the shared space because people are more motivated to adhere to agreements that they've defined for themselves. We often recommend that our clients to invite employees to consider the trade-offs involved in the decision making because these projects are really tough and difficult. But having them involved in considering the trade-offs can really help your users build a deeper understanding in the new ways of working. One commonly reported reasons for why employees continue to work desk-bound in an activity-based environment is that their perceived cost for switching is very high. And part of what contributed to that is decisions related to the design and implementation of the virtual environment often prioritizes cost or timeline and not the user experience. So when designing the technological infrastructure to support activity-based working, it is critical to consider how employees' needs are met now and how work will evolve in the new way. Treat the users as a dynamic element within the environment and provide ample amount of support to ensure that whatever has been implemented can be used by anyone in the organization. And lastly, an essential task for managers and leaders alike in times of big transition to role model a culture of trust and empowerment. Activity-based working assumes a high degree of autonomy and empowerment. And if there isn't enough trust within the organization, even if you design a space to allow activity-based working, people may refuse to work truly activity-based. It is therefore very important for organizations to build skills and abilities at the leadership level to enable them to role model new ways of working. Now, this initial research project started around this time last year, and we set out to find answers for those who are looking to rethink their office spaces and how people will show up in the office. At the beginning of this year, a pandemic happened. It created a lot of uncertainty and fear for many, and also accelerated many transformations. Starting end of March in the US, we've heard about a rotation of buzzwords going from Zoom fatigue to normal to work from home is here to stay to the office as we know it is dead. And one of the biggest changes to our day-to-day life since the onset of the pandemic is how we work. Many surveys have been conducted and many more are still in the process of gathering responses. And these are just a handful of, I think, sampling of statistics that I have handy from the reports that friends and colleagues have shared with me in the past couple weeks. Overall, we know that pre-COVID, some people worked from home more, some people worked from home less, but overall, we were at about 30%. So roughly 30% of the entire workforce worked from home. Projections for post-COVID, depending how the question is asked and how the responses are aggregated, so you may get very different numbers, but on average, we see about half of the surveyed population wants to work from home as much as possible, and over 75% wants to be able to work from home in the future at least 1 day a week. This shift in the pre-COVID world was something that we thought was only thinkable for the most progressive organizations. It is now becoming part of our shared vocabulary. And when we consider choice and flexibility now in the future, there will be an enhanced focus really on the remote component. So far, our research has demonstrated the relationship between internal mobility and various organizational impact. And some of you might ask, but how do you have internal mobility when you're working from home? Equally, in the post-COVID world or a with COVID world before the development of vaccination, internal mobility might even become something undesirable because it might spread germ. So how to ensure then that the space still has a positive impact? How to ensure that employees will still benefit from activity-based working? To be honest, it was a little confusing for us too at the beginning. We tried to tell ourselves that maybe we can just, work from the desk one day and move to the living room the next and see if that is going to make us happier. It did not. We found out that internal mobility does not apply directly to home work environment. The reality is some are lucky to have a dedicated space at home, and many of us are sharing spaces with others who might be a working spouse or partner, a roommate, or children who needs to do virtual schooling, and family or our fuzzy friends. And what we realized is that we were taking the concept of internal mobility almost too literally in this context and prior. Switching setting has its benefits, but it's not the switching itself that drove the success for LEAP projects. It is very possible that internal mobility is a reflection of how much choice and flexibility there really is within the organizational system. So we started with a brainstorm of what choice and flexibility had been about before and what they're going to mean in the future. We'll share our initial reflections through 5 sets of considerations for now, and we welcome your thoughts and ideas as well. And I think this is an evolving piece. In the past, we thought about choice and flexibility mostly in the context of how can we provide a variety of work settings in the office. And frankly, that's always been a little bit of a fight that we put on as consultants who are really trying to defend what makes activity-based working work. But in the future, we see that for some individuals or teams or organizations, home or remote work might start to become the default. In the past, we had focused more on ensuring that there is a degree of awareness and abilities among employees to use the optimal settings for work tasks. In the future, when thinking about choice, we need to know that the concept of workspace will likely expand beyond the building and the work hours. We often recommend our clients to set sharing as the default when we had implemented projects or designed for our projects before. And at the time, the recommendation came from a place where we thought sharing as a default could be an effective nudge to get the campers to mobilize and to start to experience different settings in the work environment. Now, I think in the past, we've gotten a lot of pushback sometimes when folks are more attached to their workspaces. And we see, though, in the future that sharing might no longer be something that we have to push as consultants or designers. Sharing might simply become an outcome of how the space will be utilized in the future. environment now up until this point have mostly been optimized for real-time collaboration in person or virtually. And we do often hear leadership telling us that they want to move into an activity-based space to enhance collaboration or to enable people to have more run-ins or chance encounters. In the future, there will still be an element of that in the actual physical office space. But there's also additional intention for people to come together to connect. And that is something that we constantly hear people are missing the most. There will be more infrastructure and work habits built to support asynchronous collaboration. So you're moving some of that collaboration out of that real-time component, so to speak. And when people do come together, the connection piece just becomes that much more important. And lastly, thinking about the mindset and behavior shifts necessary in this transition. In the past, a lot of our focus had been on educating and coaching managers and leaders on how can they lead mobile teams better and how can they manage by outcomes. In the future, that will still be a focus for some organizations, but for others, in addition to that, there will also be a lens to include deliberate and inclusive decision making, which is really critical to ensure that people, when they choose to work in a different location or when they choose to work at different time zones, they're able to really do that. So with refreshed thinking on choice and flexibility, we also revisited the success factors for LEAP projects. Despite these projects taking place in different organizations with different priorities, cultures, and values, they achieved success with activity-based working because they followed similar principles in the process of how they developed new ways of working. So when thinking about how to define or create the new normal for your organization, this user-centric approach becomes even more important. So instead of shaping just the layout, think about now, how can you shape the new ways of working with the users through co-creation? A lot of us have either learned from our peers or learned from resources available online, better ways to collaborate with each other. And there's not a better time than now to really capture those progress that have been made. Guide users through detaching and reattaching is still important. I think what the pandemic had forced us to do was a very rapid detaching from old ways of working. With that came lots of learnings and lots of challenges. And it's very important that when we emerge from this crisis, we become better selves and organizations are becoming better versions of themselves. So it's a really good point to start thinking about how do you want to emerge from the crisis and how can you start to work now the way you would want to emerge from the crisis. Um, when it comes to reducing friction, we've added a component of policies. And a very interesting perspective that I would like you all to consider is how your employees' needs have been met before versus now. Um, what lessons are we learning from this rapid ramp up which was considered impossible pre-COVID? Through this process, a lot of organizations have, I think by way of necessity, rapidly transformed some of the ways they do things. So this is a great time not only to celebrate the changes that have taken place, but also to reflect on what made it possible and how can we replicate that in the future. And lastly, the role for managers and leaders. We did not actually change a word for this one success factor. It continues to be role modeling a culture of trust and empowerment because we believe that this is the one critical element that's really ensuring organizations are resilient in moments of big transitions. I would say during this crisis, not all great leaders were medical experts, but every great leader focused on building an enormous amount of trust empowerment. And it's precisely that's enabling organizations to not only survive, but to thrive in a crisis. So with that, we're coming to a close of our presentation. This was our very first effort at looking through the huge amount of data that we've accumulated in the past years, and we have learned a lot from this project. Our research, as any research that we've come across, is not perfect. Our research is not an empirical study, for instance, and what we've shown are correlations and not causations. For this research, because we wanted the scale, we also had to forego a lot of data points from many projects that we knew were very interesting, but where the data were not complete. So we are opening up a field for the next effort of research for future projects. A few questions we've already started to brainstorm relate more to the questions of what then constitutes activity-based culture, and what might drive a shift toward activity-based culture. How might we influence the degree of flexibility and choice in an organizational system? We want to investigate how does activity-based working change people's mindsets and behavior in the long term. We do have some projects that completed over 10 years ago, so it would be really interesting to come back and see what is the longer term impact of this new way of working. And lastly, how will this time of everybody working from home really change people's perception about the workplace and work itself? We encourage you to submit your questions in the chat, and if it's a question that we can answer with the research that we have done so far, we'll be happy to answer. And Yolanda will help us direct those questions. But if you have new questions related to activity-based working in general, please feel free to submit them in the chat as well. We welcome your ideas, we welcome your insights, and thank you all very much for your attention.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Zoe and Robbie. I found that extremely interesting, and I loved to see actually the differences between leap and step, and actually the journey that organizations go through as they transition to activity-based working. We do have quite a number of questions that have popped up, which is great, so keep them coming. We'll start with maybe a few questions that I've seen that are more about any other differences that you would have seen in the research. Poppy and Tony had some questions like, was there any significant difference in the way of results linked to gender, for example? Also similarly, was there any difference regarding the size of the organization, or was there any notable difference triggered by the career stage? So the number of years of an employee experience or the number of years of that employee being with that organization. So would be great if you guys could sort of shed some light on these ones.
Robbie, do you want to start?
Yeah, we did look at the gender difference, although from what I recall, we didn't find significant difference there. So the men's and women's experience are very similar, at least based on the data we have. And on the size of organization, right? I think anecdotally, we haven't done this analysis rigorously, but anecdotally, we do know that for smaller organizations, it tend to be easier for consultants to plan out the change management process, and the results tend to be more positive for those. But we do have large organizations which have achieved great success after they transition into activity-based working. In fact, one of the case studies involved in our white paper talked about this large size company using activity-based working as a lever in their culture change journey.
Okay, nice. So we'll be able to read more about it in the white paper that will come back that will come out in a few days. Was there any difference, Robbie, that you have seen career stages, or any significant difference in, I don't know, the age of the respondents, or there was not? You have shown obviously that the elderly, for example, are maybe embracing activity-based working with a bit more difficulty, but was it any linked to career experience or to somebody's sort of an opposition in the organization?
Yeah. Actually, when we analyze the data, I think in some cases, the senior people who, you know, the managers of the managers, those group people, they tend to be pretty satisfied in activity-based working. And it's usually the, you know, the levels down, so those normal employees, they tend to have lower level of satisfaction. Yeah, Zoe, do you want to offer more insights on that piece?
Yeah, I think we at the time try to decipher if there are any relationships based on seniority and grouped. Well, this is actually not included in the white paper anymore, but happy to discuss more in the next research. We divided the roles into individual contributors, people managers, and then senior leaders, which we sort of coded as managers of managers, as Robbie said. And overall, the trend was not super intriguing. And it was sort of as expected. Senior leaders, which constitutes a smaller sample of our total sample population, tend to be happier with activity-based environments. But that was expected because a lot of times when we do these projects, we also do a lot of work trying to really get buy-in from the leadership layer. And I think I remember very distinctly one moment when we actually overlaid age together with role.
Right.
We found that the one insight from that overlay was that individual contributors who are also older tend to be least happy with transitions, which makes sense. I think when you think about it, it's the people who likely, they might be specialists or they might be in a very highly routinized roles, and they might have been performing very similar tasks for many, many years. So their habitual thinking have been much more deep rooted, and their personal attachment with a space is just so much more stronger.
Mm. Very nice, and good to know. There is maybe one more question that I think it links exactly to the scope of the research, and then there are some questions that are much more about the implication and the sort of consequences from the findings. Did the research cover universities or any of the learning institutions, or was at least this part of the research mainly focusing on corporate?
Robbie, do you?
Robbie?
I think based on the projects that are involved, we do not have, you know, academic organizations. So maybe in the future, when we work with more clients in that field, we will be able to provide more insights on how activity-based working would show up in, you know, universities and academic institutions.
Okay, great. So there is an opportunity to collect in the
Right.
future a bit more data on this segment. Zoe, maybe a question for you. It comes from Peter Russell. He's making the point that, of course, this is a research whereby the respondents sort of have gone through the process, and it is the responses are a perception, right, of what the employees and the respondents feel that it has changed in their lives. Of course, the employee satisfaction is vital. He's asking a question though, are there any other ways or any other research that we had access to or that we've carried out that is focusing on a harder productivity parameters? And I think, to be honest, in every single webinar that I've attended, this question comes up actually quite often. What is that absolute measure of productivity? Most probably nobody really has it, but any additional information or insights that you could share around hard productivity parameters that you have seen in some of the projects you guys have been working on?
I would say, Peter, please continue to ask that question. It's one of the hardest questions that IO psychologists have still struggling to answer. What is productivity exactly, right? We considered at the beginning of our research, looking at all of the outcome variables. What should we focus on and what can we focus on? And when we are studying something at this scale, it's really, really difficult to zoom in to something that's common. And it's actually also much more difficult because I think the majority of our population are white collar employees. And with knowledge workers, how do you even measure their output, right? But I think if we were to conduct research that's more focused within one sector or one industry or one organization or even one function, when there's even more narrow in, then you have more opportunities to narrow down depending on how you want to really discuss productivity. One thing that did become quite clear to us in our research was that within the literature, uh, it's been shown, or there's at least a firm belief that perceived productivity actually is a pretty good proxy for actual productivity. And I've seen several studies correlating employees' perceived productivity or sometimes engagement scores with the organization's actual performance. So thinking about revenue and profit margin, etc. So in that case, perceived productivity could be used as a good enough proxy when it's just impossible to get a accurate measure.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that, Zoe. I think we have maybe time for one or two very quick questions. I've also seen some very nice comments, by the way, on the chat, people doing activity-based working within homes. That's fantastic, fantastic to see. Also some very relevant questions around well-being and obviously how that plays a role in any way of working, but definitely in an activity-based combined potentially with a working from home. There is a question from Jan Zesak. Who's the biggest fan of activity-based working? Is it introverts or extroverts? I know that that's not necessarily covered by the absolute data of the research because we didn't ask that question. But would you guys, maybe Zoe, Robbie, have a go at it? Who do you think would be the biggest fan? Or is there any difference between the introverts and extroverts?
I can share my opinion. Not having really done the personality correlation with preferences for activity-based working, I think from a theoretical point of view, one within activity-based working, choice and flexibility really are the most critical factors. And when you have choice, no matter you're introvert or extrovert, you will be able to find a sweet spot that works for you. So I would say if it's a real application of ABW and it's an environment that really has the element of a choice and you're allowed to choose, then it's a win-win. It really is a place for anyone.
Fantastic. I know that there are a few more questions and I'm worried that we won't be able to cover all, but I think we've covered the vast majority. Of course, towards the end of your presentation, you also had something, insights and learnings from transitioning based on the learnings from COVID-19. So they are also, by the way, covered a bit more in detail in the white paper. So once we will send that through, maybe that will help some of you that have asked questions about transitioning to and from in the COVID-19 times. I'm hoping that everybody has enjoyed the presentation and that you found the research enlightening and enriching. We actually are quite excited about it. And if you come away from this session taking, sort of an inspiration towards maybe considering an activity-based approach in your organization, there are a number of ways you can work with us. I would say the first step is to really take a scan of your organization to see how you're working now and also examine how you were working before COVID-19. This will really tell you what are the possibilities for your organization going forward. We at Feldman & Company, we employ a number of data-driven instruments for this, which will help you to get real-time feedback so that you can adapt appropriately to your and to our rapidly changing world. So if you're interested, please reach out to one of the contacts that you see on this slide, geographic content. As mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you will receive a link to this recording very soon. The full white paper will also be sent to all of the participants and registrants for the webinar in the next few days, I think in 2 days. For the slide deck, so this exact slide deck, it is already available to our customers. But for those of you that would like to get it and receive a copy of it, please again get in contact with your regional contact. And then of course, for more insights regarding the future of work, do check out our website or follow us on LinkedIn. And do not hesitate if you would like to connect. I would love to thank Zoe and Robbie for the fantastic presentation. I've seen also some very positive comments and congratulations in the chat from the participants. So I think you guys have done a great job and really brought a lot of enlightening insights to all of us. I hope that everybody has felt a bit energized and inspired by the discussion today. And wherever you're calling from, that you're going to have a fantastic day. And thanks for joining us. And yeah, wishing everybody a great day ahead.